Hi, I was just thinking about you. I was wondering if you were going to laugh when you saw this drawing. Well, the 5S compliant shop wall cabinet project does need a couple of drawings, and I'll have those available real soon. But let's get started today. It's time to start cutting some joinery. All right, the first thing that we need to do is cut some notches. We need to cut a notch for this French cleat infrastructure support piece that's going to come through flush with the side of the cabinet. This notch will be exactly 3/4 of an inch deep. It'll be situated 3/4 of an inch from the end or the top of the cabinet. And the notch itself is going to be 6 1/4 inches long. And the reason for that extra length is because there's a French cleat on the wall, and we need 3/4 of an inch of space to lift the cabinet up over the French cleat on the wall and drop it down into place. So this notch will be 6 1/4. We need another notch down here at the bottom to accommodate this bottom infrastructure support piece. It likewise will be located 3/4 of an inch from the end of the board, which is the bottom of the cabinet. It also will be 3/4 of an inch deep, but it'll be 2.5 inches wide, exactly the width of this board. The setup to cut the notches takes a little bit of time, but then the cutting actually goes pretty fast. Now, as mentioned before, we want the notch to start 3/4 of an inch down from the top of the side piece and up from the bottom of the side piece. And actually 3/4 inch is a nominal measurement because we really want that notch to start at exactly where the thickness of the plywood is. The easiest way to do that is I've set up my fence and I've positioned it so that my piece of plywood just fits inside the cutter edge of my dado stack. Now I've installed my miter gauge and I've got a sacrificial piece here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to push that up to where the fence is set, and I'm going to screw this sacrificial piece into the miter gauge. I like to use a deep reach clamp and just hold this sacrificial piece to the miter gauge to make sure it doesn't move while I'm putting the screws in. Now, I had set this up as a temporary situation. I've got my two side pieces here, and they're labeled top of number 1 side piece, right-hand side. This is the left-hand side. Now, this is a pair, and I want the notches to be right here and right here. So, let's get these other pieces out of the way for right now. All right, here's number 2, top, right-hand side. Number 2, top left-hand side, and notice I'm turning it, okay? So now I'll put that right behind there. And we'll do the same thing with number 3. And number 4, which is a little bit wider, deeper cabinet, I'm sorry, not wider. And I've got, let's see, left side, right side, those together. And then my deepest cabinet, which is almost like a 12-inch wall cabinet, a little bit narrower. Left side and right side. All right, so now that we have our wood set up in pairs, we're almost ready to start cutting the notches, but there's still a couple of things we need to do. Now, remember, we set the fence so that we had the clearance here of exactly the thickness of a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, which is probably a little less than 3/4 of an inch. But we don't want to just put our boards up here and run this along the fence to cut our first cut. That's just not a safe thing to do. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this right here, and just so we have a little extra thickness here, we're just going to push this up to the fence and clamp this together temporarily. And now this is fixed flush with the sacrificial piece that's attached to the miter gauge. Now we can loosen the fence. I'm going to put a piece of plywood in here and I'm going to tighten up the fence. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to clamp it to my fence. Put an extra one on here. It's kind of like wearing belt and suspenders. Okay, so now what will happen, we won't need these clamps. And now what will happen is we will take each pair of our side workpieces, push them up to this piece of wood, and then as we head towards the dado stack, we won't be against the fence. And we'll go right through to make our first cut. All right, so now the last thing that we need to do is we need to set the height of our dado stack to get our 3/4 inch deep notch, but we want it to match this piece of wood because this is the wood that's going in the notch, and we'd like ideally for this wood to be flush with the back of the side piece of the cabinet. Y'all have seen me do this before. Take one of your work pieces and lay it down next to the blade. Take another workpiece and put it on top where it hangs over the blade, and just raise the blade until it just kisses that piece of wood. And right there, maybe a little bit more. And right there. There we go. I'll lock that down, and we're ready to make our first cuts. Sweet. Now we want to turn it around and cut the other end because it similarly or exactly the same is being positioned 3/4 inches from the bottom. So we'll cut this notch next. All right, so we're going to cut out this first notch in both ends of all of our side pieces to establish this critical distance right here. Then we'll go and hog out the rest of this, and I'll show you how we're going to set that up. Okay, now on the side pieces that are for the deeper cabinets, I'm just giving myself a little help here in holding this. Make sure I hold it nice and tight. You just got to have a couple of these deep reach clamps. Sometimes it's the only thing that'll work. Okay, so we want to sort of demark where the end of this notch is going to be and do that pretty precise, and then we can just hog out the stuff in the middle. So what I've done is I've measured from the top of this notch down 6 1/4 inches, and I've made a little mark there on a piece of wood. And we know we've got a piece of 3/4 inch plywood over here on the fence as a spacer. So I'm just going to stand a piece of that same stock up there. And then all I've got to do is just, using that spacer, line this up, get my fence in exactly the right position, and lock it down. And now our notch will be, the end of it will be at 6 1/4 inches from the top of the notch. So we can make our first cut and double check that. And there we go, 6 1/4 inches. So now we'll make that cut on all the rest of the boards. All right, so we want to do the same thing now on the other end because we have our bottom infrastructure support piece, which is 2.5 inches wide. So I've made a 2.5 inch mark from the top of this notch down. I've obviously got the power off on the saw, and I'm just gonna loosen my fence and slide it over until that mark lines up with the outside of the dado stack. All right, so we're ready to make our demarcation cut there. Once that's done on all the boards, then it's just taking out what's in between these two notches. All right, so now I can get rid of all this. Put this away, put this away, put this away, and we can just start hogging out material here. Just move the fence right out of the way. And all we got to do is just kind of line it up here and start getting rid of the rest of that material. And there's our notch. Well, let's do the other end. And we'll see how we did. So, doesn't get much better than that. And it's perfectly flush. So we're good to go. All right, so we've got our notches cut. We've got our upper infrastructure support piece here with the French cleat angle in it. That's set into place. Our bottom infrastructure support piece slips right into the notch down here in the end. Now what we need to do is we need to cut rabbets in the ends of our side pieces, top and bottom, so that our top and bottom pieces will slip in there. Now, the tricky part about this cut, obviously we need to get the depth just right, because when we're done, this is going to line up flush with this board here and flush with the top edges of the cabinet. So the distance in from the end is critical, but even more critical than that is the depth. Our 3/4 inch plywood is really not 3/4 of an inch thick. So what we want to do is, instead of measuring the height of the dado stack and how much we're going to cut, we're going to measure how much we're leaving. And we want to leave exactly 1/2 inch of this plywood when we cut our rabbet. So we'll be cutting a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch so that we leave exactly 1/2 inch. So let's get that set up. Now this setup is to cut the rabbets in the tops and bottoms of the side pieces of our cabinets. And what we're trying to do is we want to make sure that we've got the width of the rabbet so that our top will sit on there and be flush, and also to make sure that we have exactly 1/2 of an inch left. We're not cutting a full 1/4 inch because this is not full 3/4 inch thick plywood. We want to make sure what's really important is that we've got exactly 1/2 inch left. So I've been running some tests. Let's cut one more and see how it looks. Looks like I finally got it. It only took me about 4 test cuts. right, well, we've got all of our notches cut. We've got our rabbets cut. And so now we can kind of see how this is all going to go together. This is going to fit right through here. And our top of the cabinet will go right here. And we'll be able to glue everything up with lots of glue surface on the top corner, all across this top and back here. So we've got one more groove to cut before we can start gluing up. So let's go get set up to do that. All right, now we want to have a back in the cabinet, but we want our back to be exactly flush with the infrastructure support pieces in the back of the cabinet. Just like that, so that we don't lose any space. So what I've done is I've put the regular blade back into the table saw, and I've adjusted the fence until I got a groove that lines up with the top of the infrastructure support piece so that it's exactly in the right position. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a groove in all of the side pieces. Then I'll come back and widen that groove that direction until I get it wide enough to fit this 1/4 inch plywood back. All right, we're all set now. The fence is adjusted and I've got the blade set to cut a 1/4 inch deep kerf in here that's going to accept our back. So all we have to do is make sure we've got the inside and the bottom or the back of the cabinet, and we just run it right through. And there we go. And when it's lined up just right, this kerf will line up with the notch. And by the way, you will get a tiny little bit of cut here on the rabbet. It's very shallow and it won't make a bit of difference, but we want this to be 1/4 inch deep, so we've got a little bit of play and wiggle room for our back. So just cut all these pieces and then I'll come back and widen this. Well, you may have surmised by now that I don't like to do a whole lot of math when I'm putting together a bunch of cabinets. So to size the back of the cabinet is really quite simple. Now this cabinet is set up to be 20 inches wide, outside edge to outside edge. So all I got to do is take my outside width of my cabinet and subtract 1 1/16 of an inch. Now this cabinet is a 20 inch wide cabinet. So this is going to wind up 18 15/16 wide for the back. That's going to give me just a smidge over 3/16 of an inch into both grooves. Now remember, those grooves were cut 1/4 inch deep. As far as the length or height of the top, all you really have to do is just measure from here to here on your notches on your panel. And in all instances, my cabinets are the same height, and that measurement is 19 3/4. So now I just got to cut out the 1/4 inch plywood for my backs. I've cut one straight edge on the table saw, and now I've got my fence set at 19 3/4, and I'm ready to cut my stock for this. All right, I took those boards now and I split them in half just to make them a little easier to handle. I've got my cut side marked over here where I cut the board in half. And now I've set the fence at 19 15/16, and I need 2 of those, that size. Well, we're almost ready to glue up, but you're going to have to come back for the next video because we've got one more thing to do on this cabinet before we glue it up. And that's to cut our shelf pin holes in the sides. It's just a lot easier to do it before the cabinet is glued up and assembled. But I wanted to mock up one just to show you the assembly process. The way we'll go about this, of course, is face down and the back of the cabinet up, because that's where most of the good stuff's going on right now. We'll put some glue in this groove and we'll insert a panel into one side. Once that's in, put a little glue over here and we'll slide the second side piece onto the panel. After those are in place, then we'll take our lower infrastructure support piece, we'll attach that. And the reason we want to do that is because that'll allow us to push this back piece down flush against this back support piece, and that'll square up the whole cabinet. Then we'll attach our French cleat upper support bracket up here. We'll glue our top into the rabbets, and we'll glue our bottom into the rabbets, and the cabinet will be assembled. Then we'll start building the face frames. So be sure to come back for the next video. Look forward to seeing you, and thank you so much for watching this one.